As the grotesque dirus ents advanced through the dark forest, their bark shells burned away but their confidence completely intact, the mercenaries lost their nerve almost immediately. Even after surviving the ambush and witnessing that fire had exposed the monsters' vulnerable inner bodies, most of them still saw only towering, monstrous figures closing in from every direction. Fear spread quickly through the formation. Men who had boasted confidently outside the forest now slowly stepped backward, silently preparing to abandon the mission altogether. At that moment, Ghislain stepped forward instead of retreating. Without raising his voice, he mocked their hesitation and challenged their pride as soldiers. Then, to prove his point rather than argue it, he picked up a spear and hurled it with overwhelming force. The weapon pierced through one dirus ent and struck another behind it, immediately revealing that the creatures had changed after losing their outer bark. Ghislain explained that the fire had stripped away not only their armor, but also the vines that allowed them to attack from range. In his eyes, they were no longer terrifying guardians of the forest, but merely oversized, slow-moving targets. Even then, however, the mercenaries remained paralyzed. Their fear wasn't logical anymore. It was instinctive. Realizing words alone wouldn't move them, Ghislain abandoned the role of commander and chose to become the spearhead himself. He retrieved an enormous great sword designed for hunting giant monsters and planted it into the earth with a heavy impact that drew everyone's attention. Though those around him saw only a young noble acting recklessly, Ghislain's thoughts drifted elsewhere. In another life, battlefields had been his home. He had once led mercenaries across countless wars and mastered more weapons than most knights would ever touch. To him, this situation felt strangely familiar rather than frightening. Jillian and Kyra immediately tried to step in and stop him, believing it absurd for the employer himself to stand at the front while hired warriors hid behind him. Belinda was especially furious, unable to accept that the young master she had watched grow up would throw himself into danger, while everyone else hesitated. Yet Ghislain calmly declared that from now on he intended to stand at the front in every battle. Before anyone could stop him, one of the mana cores inside him began spinning at full force. Mana surged through his body, and he launched himself forward. The moment Ghislain entered combat, the atmosphere changed completely. His great sword carved through the first dirus ent in a single strike, splitting the enormous creature apart and freezing the battlefield in silence. Red steam escaped from his breath as his mana circulated at maximum efficiency. One after another, the monsters attacked him, but Ghislain met them head-on. He blocked heavy blows, redirected force, dodged crushing strikes, and countered with brutal precision. The great sword repeatedly buried itself deep into the monsters' softened flesh until their bodies tore apart under sheer power. To the mercenaries watching, it seemed impossible. They had assumed his strength came from arrogance and status. Yet now they watched him cut down creatures larger than houses while barely speaking. Belinda couldn't understand how someone his age possessed such control and destructive force. Jillian and Kyor, both experienced fighters, were equally shocked because this was the first time they had seen Ghislain fight seriously while using mana. Unknown to everyone else, Ghislain was achieving this with only a single activated core, compensating for limited reserves through perfect control and timing. As the battle dragged on, however, Ghislain also began reaching his limits. The dirus ents were slow but overwhelmingly powerful, and each block strike sent shockwaves through his body. Yet instead of exhausting him mentally, combat awakened something buried inside him. Fighting at the front, carrying danger on his shoulders, felt natural to him again. He remembered why mercenaries in his previous life had followed him, not because of strategy alone, but because he never asked others to stand where he wouldn't. More and more dirus ents focused entirely on killing him, forcing Ghislain to consider activating his second core despite the strain. As additional mana flooded his body and his eyes deepened in color, Jillian finally snapped out of his shock and charged forward with his axe. Kyor and the Cerberus Mercenary Corps followed immediately, throwing themselves into the battle with savage enthusiasm. Their aggression disrupted the monsters and gave Ghislain room to breathe. Watching this unfold, the remaining mercenaries became conflicted. Their employer had never ordered them forward or demanded loyalty. He had simply gone ahead alone. That sight stirred something in them. One older mercenary stepped forward first, then another. Soon hesitation disappeared. Encouraged and somewhat shamed by Belinda's furious scolding, the rest of the mercenaries finally raised their weapons and joined the fight. After the battle with the Dirasens ended, Belinda stayed close to Ghislaine rather than joining the attack herself. She judged that the mercenaries already had enough numbers to finish the remaining monsters, and that interfering directly might only disrupt Ghislaine's movements. Instead, she quietly watched the battlefield, ready to drag him out by force if things became truly dangerous. The mercenaries, inspired by Ghislaine's earlier charge, finally surged forward together and overwhelmed the monsters through sheer numbers. Individually, they weren't powerful enough to challenge creatures like the Dirasens, but over 100 fighters attacking simultaneously slowly shifted the battle. The monsters were cut apart one after another, black liquid spilling across the forest floor. Still, victory wasn't painless. Whenever a Dirasent managed to strike, mercenaries were hurled away or nearly crushed beneath enormous limbs. During one such moment, a fallen painless. Whenever a Dirasent managed to strike, mercenaries were hurled away or nearly crushed beneath enormous limbs. During one such moment, a fallen mercenary believed he was about to die beneath a descending foot, only to open his eyes and find Ghislaine standing between him and death, holding back the impact with his oversized sword. Ghislaine calmly told him to escape, then immediately severed the creature's leg and tore it apart piece by piece. Watching this, the mercenary realized Ghislaine's style didn't resemble noble knights at all. It was brutal, efficient, and frighteningly direct, closer to a battlefield veteran or a hardened mercenary than a noble heir. Once the last Dirasent collapsed, there was no celebration. Exhausted mercenaries dropped where they stood, but their attention remained fixed on Ghislaine. Planting his sword into the ground, he looked across the group and addressed them coldly. Rather than praising them, he pointed out that many of them had almost abandoned the fight, despite still having the ability to resist. Ghislaine explained that surrendering to fear before exhausting every option only led to death. His actions during the battle had not been accidental. He had intentionally fought at the front and refrained from ordering them forward, because he believed people had to choose to fight for themselves. By surviving impossible odds and proving that the monsters could be defeated, he wanted to replace fear with confidence. Then he made his expectations clear. Anyone who tried to flee in future battles would lose their head first. At the same time, he promised that although he couldn't guarantee everyone's survival, he would personally do everything possible to save as many as he could. Finally, he declared that he would always stand at the front and demanded they follow him with all their strength. The mood among the mercenaries shifted completely. They no longer saw him as an inexperienced noble playing at war, but as a leader willing to face danger before anyone else. Belinda watched all of this with mixed emotions. Recently, Ghislaine had become strangely relaxed and playful compared to his former self. But what she saw now felt entirely different. For brief moments during battle, he carried a heavy presence that reminded her of someone who had already lived through countless wars. Yet the strange part was that as soon as his speech ended, he returned to moving casually among the mercenaries, helping treat wounds, patting shoulders, and joking as though he hadn't just terrified everyone minutes earlier. Even Belinda, who had watched him grow up, couldn't understand who he had become. After a short rest, the group resumed work, and the mercenaries' attitude had completely changed. They followed orders more seriously and moved efficiently without complaint. Ghislaine then ordered them to collect portions of the Dirasent's inner bark. At first they questioned why anyone would gather monster flesh, but he explained that the material could be used to make equipment resistant to heat and useful for controlling fire. The explanation impressed them, but Ghislaine's real interest went further than that. From knowledge gained in his previous life, he knew the material possessed extraordinary fire resistance and could become extremely valuable later. Rather than stripping everything immediately, he ordered them to gather only what they needed and continue moving, intending to return later once the route was secure. The following days quickly destroyed any remaining optimism. From the second day onward, monsters attacked continuously. By the third day, the mercenaries finally understood why the Forest of Beasts had remained untouched for so long. The creatures inside were larger, stronger, stranger, and far more relentless than anything outside the forest. Monsters that would normally require a handful of fighters now demanded overwhelming force to defeat. Their appearances ranged from grotesque to outright horrifying, and attacks came at all hours, leaving the group unable to sleep properly. Progress became painfully slow because they had to cut paths while fighting endlessly. Many mercenaries started questioning whether clearing the forest was even possible without the resources of an entire kingdom. Yet despite their exhaustion, one thing kept them moving: Ghislain. True to his word, he always rushed ahead first whenever monsters appeared. He took the greatest risks, absorbed the most injuries, and repeatedly saved lives by arriving before anyone else. Belinda became increasingly frustrated because his tactics made no sense for a commander. His judgment, timing, and orders were exceptional, but he constantly pushed his own body beyond reason. To her, it seemed as though he valued everyone else's survival more than his own. Meanwhile, the mercenaries slowly changed. What began as fear and admiration gradually became trust. They started saying that staying close to Ghislain felt safer than staying with anyone else. Some joked that he must have been a charge unit commander in another life because he always led assaults personally and fought like someone born for the front lines. The comparison was strangely accurate. Unlike most nobles, Ghislain never looked down on mercenaries or treated them as disposable. He fought beside them, bled with them, and protected them whenever possible. That attitude created something unfamiliar among the group: loyalty. More and more mercenaries began believing that if anyone could get them through the forest of beasts alive, it would be their employer. But not everyone adapted the same way. While some found courage through Ghislain's example, others were slowly breaking under the endless battles and constant pressure. Among those whose spirit had begun to crack was a mercenary named Manus, a man with sharp features and the uneasy expression of someone already thinking about escape. As the expedition continued deeper into the forest of beasts, exhaustion slowly began eating away at the mercenaries more effectively than the monsters themselves. Among them, Manus quietly started planting doubt. Rather than openly rebelling, he used questions and observations to unsettle the others. He pointed out how strange their mission really was. They were marching toward an unknown destination inside a forest nobody had successfully explored, guided only by their employer's confidence in vague promises. No one knew exactly where they were going, what they were looking for, or how much farther remained. Manus argued that Ghislain wasn't simply reckless, but dangerously committed to his own convictions, and warned that eventually everyone would die following him. His words carried weight because they reflected fears many already had, but hadn't spoken aloud. Yet Torin, one of the older mercenaries, pushed back immediately. He reminded everyone that without Ghislain, most of them would already be dead. Unlike ordinary nobles who stayed behind while mercenaries acted as expendable shields, Ghislain fought at the front and risked himself more than anyone. Torin argued that Ghislain's actions weren't empty idealism. He had repeatedly proven his ability to survive and protect others. Around them, more mercenaries began agreeing. They admitted Ghislain didn't treat them like disposable tools, and that his leadership felt experienced in a way that didn't match his age. Manus continued insisting that eventually exhaustion would kill them all anyway, and that surviving was what made a true mercenary, not blind loyalty. Secretly, however, Manus wasn't trying to save everyone. He wanted enough people to support withdrawing so he wouldn't have to flee alone or face Ghislain's anger. The argument might have continued if Torin hadn't pointed toward Ghislain, treating wounded mercenaries nearby. Everyone fell silent. Ghislain wasn't using cheap supplies either. He was spending expensive medicines and potions on ordinary mercenaries whose lives were worth less than the supplies being consumed. That single sight weakened Manus' argument more than anything else. Mercenaries began murmuring among themselves that no noble would spend that kind of money on hired fighters if he planned to abandon them. Others noted that Ghislain's treatment methods themselves seemed unusually skilled. Belinda, meanwhile, watched in growing disbelief. Not only was Ghislain spending resources carelessly in her eyes, but he was personally treating injuries instead of delegating the work. Whenever she complained that he should save medicine for himself, Ghislain brushed her off, saying supplies existed to be used when needed. He also criticized the mercenaries' rough methods of wound care and began teaching proper treatment directly, correcting splints, stopping dangerous habits, and showing them basic first aid. The mercenaries who received his help became increasingly loyal to him. Belinda found herself disturbed for a different reason. Ghislaine had never been attentive to others before. Watching him calmly handle injuries and manage people made her question whether the person she had raised was somehow changing into someone else entirely. Even while joking to herself about dark sorcery, she couldn't shake the feeling that this version of Ghislaine carried experiences he should never have had. By the fifth day, after endless fighting and painfully slow progress, the expedition finally reached a small lake. The sight of clear, cold water immediately lifted everyone's mood. Mercenaries rushed toward it to drink and wash away days of dirt and exhaustion. Unlike their stale carried water, the lake felt refreshing and alive. Ghislaine unusually didn't stop them and instead quietly observed the surroundings. Internally, he confirmed that his remembered route remained mostly accurate. Although the current expedition wasn't following the exact path from his previous life, enough landmarks matched that he could continue adjusting based on memory. Still, reaching the lake wasn't reassuring. It made him more cautious. According to what he remembered, this lake marked an important transition point and the beginning of significantly greater danger. Monsters ahead would become more aggressive, and new threats would begin appearing. Despite this, he ordered the group to rest for the day, clean themselves, reorganize supplies, and rebuild morale. The mercenaries quickly established camp. Since Belinda rarely joined battles directly anymore and conserved energy, she prepared warm soup using spices, jerky, and fresh water. She insisted Ghislaine eat properly, even when he suggested giving the food to the others. Watching him receive special treatment, the mercenaries began teasing him, joking that while they chewed stale jerky, their employer enjoyed fresh meals. Some even asked Belinda to become camp cook for everyone. In her own way, without warning, she threw a fork hard enough to embed it into a nearby tree directly beside one mercenary's head. Instantly, the teasing stopped. Smiling sweetly while terrifying everyone, she informed them that they all had hands and could cook for themselves because she was busy taking care of Ghislaine. The mercenaries obediently agreed. Ghislaine laughed quietly and suggested she help the others too, since they'd been working hard. But Belinda ignored the suggestion and pushed the soup toward him again. When he tried refusing, she reminded him that she used to force him to eat properly as a child and casually waved another fork nearby as a warning. Realizing resistance was pointless, Ghislaine quietly accepted the meal. As night settled over the forest, the atmosphere changed completely. During the day, the mercenaries had become accustomed to constant attacks and endless combat. But nighttime brought something far worse: silence. The distant cries echoing through the darkness weren't the straightforward roars of monsters charging to kill. They sounded distant, distorted, and strangely deliberate, scraping at people's nerves more than open battle ever could. Even exhausted mercenaries struggled to sleep. They built bonfires and hung lamps throughout the camp, creating a fragile circle of light in the middle of endless blackness. Yet while everyone else tried to rest, Ghislaine remained awake, sitting quietly by the fire. When Belinda asked why he wasn't sleeping, he revealed what had been bothering him. Monsters that had attacked relentlessly for days had suddenly stopped appearing at night. To him, that wasn't relief. It meant something stronger was controlling the area. Belinda immediately understood. If ordinary monsters were disappearing after dark, then something even they feared had begun moving. Nearby mercenaries overheard and felt their stomachs tighten. 5 days earlier, they would have dismissed such speculation, but Ghislaine's predictions had repeatedly saved them. Nobody laughed anymore. As darkness deepened, an uneasy wind moved through the trees. Ghislaine, Jillian, Kaor, and Belinda all rose almost simultaneously. They could feel it, countless eyes hidden somewhere beyond the reach of their lamps. Ghislaine spread his mana outward and quietly counted. The result disturbed even him. According to the records he remembered, there should have been around 200. Instead, he sensed more than 300. Then the attack began, not against their bodies, but against their surroundings. Something moved through the darkness with impossible speed and started stealing the hanging lamps one by one. Each disappearing light reduced visibility and made the darkness feel heavier. For brief moments while lamps vanished, humanoid outlines flickered at the edge of vision before disappearing again. Kaor immediately wanted to charge with the Cerberus Mercenary Corps, driven by instinct and irritation at being hunted, but Ghislaine stopped him. These enemies weren't trying to kill them immediately. They were observing, testing, and applying pressure. Soon, strange laughter echoed through the forest and the presence faded away. Ghislain ordered everyone not to relight the stolen lamps despite protests. Then he finally revealed the enemy's name, the Pallor. According to knowledge carried from his previous life, the Pallor weren't ordinary monsters, but descendants of an ancient race that had degraded over time into hunters of darkness. They avoided direct confrontation and instead preyed psychologically. Their greatest ability allowed them to merge into darkness and avoid normal physical attacks almost entirely. More importantly, they feared light and deliberately removed it before attacking. Ghislain explained that previous expeditions had failed because they misunderstood the Pallor and tried brute force. Strong fighters chased them, but the creatures adapted, avoided combat, and instead kidnapped weaker soldiers one by one until morale collapsed. The next day, Ghislain changed their entire approach. Rather than advancing, the expedition stopped near the lake and built a temporary clearing. While the mercenaries rested and recovered, Ghislain quietly prepared. Jillian questioned the decision, and Ghislain explained that allowing the Pallor to continue following them would eventually destroy the expedition. They had to eliminate them before moving deeper. Jillian proposed using mass arrow volleys, and Ghislain agreed to test their reaction. When night returned, the mercenaries waited with bows ready. Once the oppressive feeling returned and hidden eyes gathered again, Ghislain ordered everyone to fire. Hundreds of arrows vanished into darkness and hit absolutely nothing. The only response was mocking laughter. Even though everyone could feel countless enemies surrounding them, not one arrow connected. Panic immediately spread. Jillian prepared to use mana to strengthen attacks, but Ghislain stopped him again. He explained that mana itself emitted light, and that revealing they possessed too many mana users would only cause the Pallor to change tactics. Instead of surrounding them openly, the creatures would retreat and begin abducting mercenaries individually. That had happened before in the records, Ghislain remembered. Eventually, soldiers had been found partially eaten and scattered through the forest, while powerful warriors remained unable to force direct battle. Even stronger expeditions than theirs had failed for that reason. After the Pallor withdrew again, Ghislain gathered everyone and explained everything in detail. The mercenaries listened in disbelief. Monsters that could ignore normal attacks, steal light, and hunt psychologically sounded absurd, but they had witnessed enough already to stop doubting him. Suggestions came quickly. More lamps, more torches, using mana weapons to expose them. Belinda even demonstrated coating her dagger in mana and argued they could strike once the light revealed them. Ghislain praised the idea but rejected it for now. Their enemies were intelligent. If pressured too early, they would adapt and stop exposing themselves altogether. As the explanation continued, fear spread through the camp. The monsters they had faced before were brutal but understandable. These creatures were patient. They watched. They waited. They weakened people before attacking. Several mercenaries suggested retreating entirely, but Ghislain refused immediately. Turning back meant admitting defeat to enemies who had not even attacked directly yet. He explained that previous armies had eventually succeeded only after bringing powerful mages in overwhelming force. But unlike them, he possessed something more valuable than strength: information. Everyone else had entered blind. He already knew their methods, habits, and weaknesses. Standing in front of the uneasy campfire, watching the dark forest beyond, Ghislain quietly made his decision. He wasn't planning to survive the Pallor. He intended to destroy them before they realized they had become the hunted instead of the hunters. Ghislain believed that battles were won long before swords ever crossed. The key was never allowing the enemy to dictate the battlefield. Instead of waiting to be hunted by the Pallor night after night, he gathered the mercenaries and revealed the plan he had prepared in advance. As he explained their enemy's weakness and described how the battle would unfold, the mood of the camp transformed. Fear gradually gave way to confidence. The mercenaries realized that Ghislain had anticipated this encounter and had entered the forest carrying tools meant specifically for this situation. Some still looked uncertain, but most were visibly reassured. They began believing that victory was actually possible if they trusted him. Ghislain ordered everyone to rest during the day because once the fighting started, there would be no time left to recover. The mercenaries obeyed and conserved their strength. When night returned, the pallor resumed their familiar ritual. One by one, they stole the lamps while the mercenaries deliberately acted defeated and helpless. They lowered their heads and stayed silent, pretending fear had already broken them. The pallor took the bait. On the following night, the final lamp vanished and complete darkness swallowed the clearing. The forest became impossibly black, dense enough that even nearby companions disappeared from view. The mercenaries stood silently with weapons ready while cold sweat ran down their backs. Then the sound began, soft movements through the darkness and eerie laughter creeping closer. Hundreds of invisible presences slowly surrounded them. The pallor believed the hunt was over. With no light remaining, they thought victory was certain. That was the moment Ghislain gave the signal. Everyone tore open the objects hidden in their hands. Instantly, over 100 magical light scrolls activated at once. Brilliant white spheres floated upward and transformed the clearing into daylight. The sudden explosion of illumination exposed everything the darkness had hidden. The pallor shrieked violently as their concealment vanished. For the first time, the mercenaries saw what had stalked them. Towering skeletal creatures with slit eyes, stretched mouths full of sharp teeth, exposed veins and long scythe-like claws. Tentacles dangled from their arms, the same appendages used to steal the lamps. Horror froze the mercenaries for only a second before Ghislain shouted for them to attack. The Cerberus mercenary corps charged first without hesitation. Kaior fought like a man who had been waiting for this moment, grabbing pallor heads and driving blades into their necks with savage enthusiasm. Jillian joined beside him, crushing skulls with powerful axe strikes, while finally releasing the mana he had been suppressing. The rest of the mercenaries followed. This time their attacks landed. Steel tore flesh instead of passing through shadows. But the pallor adapted quickly. Though strongest in darkness, they were dangerous even in open combat. Their claws cut through armor and flesh with ease, and casualties began appearing immediately. When several pallors rushed directly toward Ghislain, Belinda stepped forward. Rather than staying back as she usually did, she unleashed hidden weapons from her clothing. Daggers flew like living creatures, weaving through the battlefield and piercing enemies repeatedly. When surrounded, she revealed blades hidden in her heels and moved with ruthless precision, carving through attackers and buying precious seconds. Ghislain used that opening to take command. The mercenaries had abandoned formation in their excitement and were turning the battle into chaos. Ghislain immediately began reorganizing the battlefield, shouting orders and repositioning everyone. Shield users formed circles while attackers moved behind them. Jillian, Kaior, and the Cerberus Mercenary Corps stabilized collapsing positions and covered gaps. Slowly, the disorganized mob became a functioning army. Once the formation was secure, Ghislain finally moved. Until now, he had fought while limiting himself, but this battle demanded everything. He activated both of his mana cores simultaneously. Red energy erupted around him, and his eyes burned crimson. His movements accelerated beyond what anyone present had seen before. Across the darkness, red trails appeared and vanished like lightning. Every flash ended with another pallor losing its head. The mercenaries watched in disbelief. They had already considered him frighteningly strong, but this was different. He seemed less like a noble and more like a force tearing through the battlefield itself. Under Ghislain's assault, and with the formations finally holding, the pallor numbers began collapsing rapidly. Realizing they had fallen into a trap, the creatures panicked. Their hidden leader attempted to retreat, intending to preserve the species and abandon the battle. But Ghislain noticed it. Amid the chaos, he identified the one giving commands and chased it down. Before it could escape into darkness, he intercepted it. The creature tried to strike first, but Ghislain moved faster. Descending from above with both cores burning, he brought down his sword and split the pallor leader in half with a single strike. The effect was immediate. Without leadership, the pallor descended into confusion and scattered. Ghislain ordered the final assault. The mercenaries threw aside caution and charged. Driven by exhaustion, fear, and anger from days of being hunted, they slaughtered the remaining creatures until the battlefield was covered with broken bodies. Only a few escaped back into the forest. Ghislain stopped the pursuit, knowing darkness still belonged to the survivors. When the battle finally ended, he exhaled and nearly lost his balance from the strain of using both cores. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then realization spread across the battlefield. They had survived. Slowly at first, then all at once the mercenaries erupted into cheers. After days of fear and impossible battles, they had defeated enemies that even previous expeditions had failed to overcome. If Ghislain had not prepared for the battle and revealed the pallors under the light, none of them would have survived long enough to understand what had killed them. Watching the mercenaries celebrate, Kayor found himself staring at Ghislain with a different expression than before. He quietly asked Jillian whether the young lord had always been this monstrous, or if the Ferdium family had secretly been hiding some unbelievable talent all this time. Jillian couldn't answer properly because even he had never witnessed Ghislain fighting at this level. Up until now, Ghislain had always seemed to hold something back. Tonight had shown something entirely different. Yet Jillian only smiled faintly and answered that there was one thing he knew for certain. Among people their age, nobody stood above their young lord. There was admiration in his voice, but also pride. Belinda reacted differently. While everyone else celebrated, she forced her way through the crowd and immediately began inspecting Ghislain's injuries. More than anyone, she understood how impossible his performance should have been. She had watched him grow, trained with him, and knew his limits better than most. That was exactly why she had stepped forward earlier against the Pallors. She never expected him to exceed those limits so completely. Ghislain brushed it off casually and redirected attention to the wounded instead, insisting the formation nearly collapsed at the beginning and that everyone had contributed. But Belinda ignored his words and focused entirely on treating him, irritated and anxious at the same time. Around them, the mercenaries had also begun realizing something else. Belinda herself was no ordinary maid. Her earlier performance with hidden daggers and mana had left an impression. The camp slowly returned to order as Ghislain gave instructions to treat the injured, gather corpses, and restore the lights before darkness reclaimed the clearing. While cleaning the battlefield, Gordon wandered farther from camp than he realized. He dragged corpses toward a pile, muttering to himself and thinking about training harder once they returned. Because the magical lights had begun fading, the darkness around the forest thickened again. Gordon suddenly felt uneasy and decided to return quickly. He reached for what looked like another dead pallor. Then its eyes snapped open. Before he could react, tentacles exploded outward and wrapped around his body, arms, neck, and legs. His scream echoed across the clearing as he was dragged into the darkness. Everyone turned instantly. Mercenaries rushed forward but stopped at the forest edge. No one wanted to enter. They had just fought for survival and knew what darkness meant against the pallor. Regret spread across the group. Most accepted it immediately. Accidents happen. Mercenaries died. Kayor even stated bluntly that this was part of the profession. Death caused by mistakes was something mercenaries accepted. Belinda and Jillian expected Ghislain to do the same. Instead, Ghislain drew his sword. Belinda and Jillian immediately stopped him. The mercenaries themselves shook their heads. Nobody blamed him. Nobody expected him to go. But Ghislain stood silently for a moment before speaking words that froze everyone in place. He said he had never once abandoned those who followed him. Before Belinda could react properly, he disappeared into the forest. Belinda exploded with frustration and immediately chased after him, leaving Jillian to follow as well. Kayor watched them vanish and grumbled angrily, but stayed behind to manage the camp. The mercenaries returned to work under his threats while he sat there irritated, secretly annoyed that part of him wanted to join. Inside the forest, Ghislain pursued Gordon at full speed. Tracking pallors in darkness bordered on impossible because they blended completely into shadows. But Gordon was human. Ghislain shouted with mana, strengthening his voice, ordering Gordon to keep screaming. The sound echoed through the forest. It was reckless. In the forest of beasts, making noise at night could attract countless horrors. Yet Ghislain gambled that other monsters still feared the pallors enough to stay hidden. Gordon heard him. The realization nearly broke him. The pallor dragging him sensed the danger too and sealed Gordon's mouth with its tentacles. Gordon struggled helplessly. His thoughts drifted strangely as despair settled in. He remembered Ghislain once saying he would teach him to read after they returned. Gordon had intended to refuse because training mattered more. Now he wondered if that chance was gone forever. Meanwhile, Ghislain kept running. But without screams, even he began losing direction. He activated light scrolls while moving and searched for signs on the ground. Belinda and Jillian eventually caught up and helped track, but little by little the traces disappeared. Even experts couldn't keep following forever. Eventually, both of them tried convincing Ghislain to turn back. They argued Gordon was probably already dead. Ghislain didn't move. He stood in silence and listened. If there was even one sound left, one sign, then suddenly a muffled noise reached all three of them. Without exchanging another word, Ghislain, Belinda, and Jillian exploded forward into the darkness. After the battle with the Pallors ended, one surviving creature managed to drag Gordon deep into the darkness before anyone noticed. Unlike the others who accepted his loss as unavoidable, Ghislain refused to abandon him. Guided only by Gordon's fading screams, he charged into the forest despite every warning. Belinda and Jillian chased after him, furious and worried, while the rest remained behind. Deep inside the dark woods, the Pallor finally reached its hidden cave and believed it had escaped pursuit. While hurriedly opening the concealed entrance, it loosened the tentacle sealing Gordon's mouth. Gordon seized that tiny chance and screamed with everything he had left, shouting for help louder than he ever had in his life. The Pallor panicked and tried to silence him again, throwing him to the ground and deciding to kill him immediately before hiding. Just before the creature's scythe-like arm came down, help arrived. Belinda's dagger flew first and buried itself in the Pallor's arm, the poison immediately burning through its pale flesh. Almost instantly after, Ghislain's sword pierced through its head, and Jillian finished it by splitting the body apart with his axe. Gordon survived. When Ghislain activated a light scroll and calmly told him that he had done well, Gordon completely broke down. The fact that someone had actually come back for him, risking their own life in the forest of beasts, was something he had never imagined possible. His tears turned awkward a second later when Belinda pointed out that he had apparently lost control of more than just his emotions during the ordeal. Rather than returning immediately, Ghislain investigated the place where the Pallor had been hiding. Inside the cave, they discovered the remaining escaped Pallors gathered together. Injured and weakened from the earlier battle, they stood no chance. Ghislain ordered everyone to eliminate them, and Belinda and Jillian cut through them mercilessly. After clearing the cave, they noticed something unexpected: piles of bones mixed with old equipment and human remains. These weren't ancient. Judging by the condition of the clothes and tools, people had entered the forest of beasts in recent years, despite the estate's restrictions. Ghislain quietly took note of it. Someone had been exploring this place in secret, though he decided to leave that mystery for later. The cave was sealed, and the group returned. Back at camp, nobody expected to see Gordon again. When Ghislain stepped out from the trees, followed by Belinda, Jillian, and finally Gordon himself, the mercenaries erupted. The cheers were less about Gordon surviving and more about what the rescue meant. For them, this wasn't normal. Employers didn't risk themselves for mercenaries. Nobles gave orders from behind. Mercenaries were hired because they were expendable. Yet Ghislain had crossed into darkness alone for one man. That single action changed something fundamental inside the group. The trust they had slowly built turned into something stronger. They started believing that following him wasn't simply a contract anymore. It might actually keep them alive. Not everyone felt inspired. Manus watched everything with growing irritation. To him, the others were becoming blind. Every victory felt less like skill and more like impossible luck. He believed they were gambling with death and getting away with it only because Ghislain kept succeeding by absurd margins. In his mind, the forest itself was proof they would eventually die. He stopped trying to convince people immediately because morale was too high, but he quietly decided to wait. Once more people died, fear would return, and then he would gather enough supporters to abandon the expedition. The next morning, the expedition resumed. With the Pallors destroyed, the pressure surrounding the camp disappeared almost immediately. Monster attacks became less frequent and less coordinated. The mercenaries noticed the difference but stayed disciplined instead of relaxing. Their attitude had changed. They listened faster, moved in formation, and trusted commands without hesitation. Ghislaine noticed it immediately. The endless fighting and repeated brushes with death had transformed them. They were no longer acting like scattered hired swords, but more like a trained military unit. Kayor noticed it too. Looking at the mercenaries moving together with unexpected discipline, he admitted that people who had originally joined for money were now behaving like actual soldiers. Jillian answered simply that it was all because of their young lord. Kayor wanted to argue, but for once he stayed quiet. That bothered him more than anything. Normally, he never backed away from a fight or an argument. Yet recently, he kept doing exactly that around Ghislaine and Jillian. He found himself thinking about it more than he wanted to admit. Without realizing it, the group crossed completely out of Pallor territory and continued deeper into the Forest of Beast. After leaving Pallor territory, the expedition expected relief, but instead the brutal cycle of battle began again. Monsters returned without mercy, and day after day the mercenaries fought while cutting deeper into the Forest of Beasts. Exhaustion accumulated until even Ghislaine began to feel tempted to abandon everything and return home. Yet unlike everyone else, he knew there was something hidden in this forest worth risking lives for. Without that certainty, even he would never have entered such a place. What surprised him wasn't the danger, it was the mercenaries. Instead of collapsing mentally, they endured. Their bodies looked ready to fail at any moment, but their eyes still carried determination. Ghislaine realized he had misjudged them. Normally, he would have offered extra rewards to keep morale from breaking, but now he saw something different. They were no longer fighting only for money. They had started treating the mission itself as something they wanted to complete. Only Manus looked increasingly unstable, pacing anxiously and silently suffering while waiting for everyone else to finally break. As the days passed, something unexpected happened. Although the battles remained intense, casualties slowly decreased. Constant life-and-death combat had forced the mercenaries to grow stronger. They adapted, sharpened their instincts, and began surviving situations that would have killed them earlier. After more than 2 weeks of this, Ghislaine finally announced that their destination was close. Those words immediately reignited everyone's energy, but as they pushed forward, another strange problem appeared. There were fewer monsters. The endless attacks that had defined the forest suddenly stopped. The silence became more unsettling than combat itself. Even Ghislaine couldn't explain it. The forest had always felt unnatural, but now it seemed completely dead. No insects, no movement, barely even wind. Jillian and Cor scouted ahead and found nothing. With no explanation available, Ghislaine ordered everyone to rest and save their strength for the final push. For the first time since entering the forest, they experienced something close to recovery. The next day remained quiet. No attacks came. The mercenaries joked, stretched sore muscles, and worked faster than ever. Hope spread through the group as Ghislaine repeatedly checked his maps and confirmed they were nearly there. Relief started replacing tension. They had survived impossible battles and crossed territory no one dared enter. Ghislaine himself felt excitement building because his gamble was about to prove everyone wrong. Then the forest shook. A deep tremor rolled through the trees. Jillian was sent ahead and returned moments later screaming for immediate evacuation. Before anyone could react, trees began exploding apart in the distance. Something enormous was moving toward them. When the creature finally emerged, the entire group froze. It was a gigantic red-scaled snake, far larger than a normal python. The blood python. Even among giant snake monsters, blood pythons were known as nightmares. Their scales resisted weapons, their venom was lethal, and they were supposed to live far deeper in the forest. Ghislaine immediately understood something had gone wrong. This monster should not have been here. The mercenaries entered formation and launched arrows at Ghislaine's command, but nothing worked. Every arrow bounced harmlessly off the snake's scales. Then without warning, the creature moved. Despite its size, it accelerated instantly and swallowed a frontline mercenary whole before anyone could react. The man disappeared alive. Everyone watched in horror as the shape slid through the creature's throat and settled inside its body. The blood python simply looked at the others afterward, almost calmly, as if deciding who to eat next. For the first time since entering the forest, nobody had an answer. Against every previous enemy, there had always been a weakness: fire, formation, light, tactics, timing. But here their attacks did nothing. Retreating slowly, the mercenaries looked toward Ghislain automatically, expecting orders. Yet Ghislain remained silent. Belinda quietly told him to escape. She didn't care about the mercenaries. Only his survival mattered. Gillian said he would stay and fulfill the contract by buying time, even asking Ghislain to look after his daughter if he died. Even Kyra agreed and advised retreat. In his view, mercenaries accepted death as part of their work. Losing people was normal. Ghislain said nothing. He simply stood there with lowered eyes, staring at the blood python. He knew the truth no one else did. If they ran now, most wouldn't escape. Some would die to the snake, others would lose the path and disappear into the forest forever. They had fought through monsters, darkness, exhaustion, and fear to get here. The destination he had chased for so long was right in front of them. And now, standing before a monster that shouldn't even exist in this part of the forest, Ghislain was forced to face the possibility that after surviving everything, they might still fail at the very end. Ghislain had prepared for this expedition using everything he remembered from his previous life. But standing before the blood python reminded him of a truth he already knew. Plans never survive reality perfectly. He had no pride about retreating. In both lives, he had learned that escaping to wait for a better opportunity could sometimes be the correct answer. More than anyone, he understood that dying here would doom not only himself, but the entire Ferdium estate. Everything he had done so far, entering the forest of beasts, risking lives, enduring endless battles, was to stop the ruin he had already witnessed once. Yet as he looked at the situation, another realization surfaced. There are battles where retreat is simply another path toward destruction. If they abandon this chance now, there would not be another one. Considering the estate's condition, the enemies waiting outside and the opportunities hidden ahead, reaching the destination remained their only meaningful path forward. Ghislain accepted that many people would still die. He had lost countless comrades before and knew that leadership never meant everyone survived. But that did not mean surrendering everyone's lives without resistance. Before he could speak, Manus exploded. Having endured the journey only through fear and self-preservation, he finally snapped. He shouted that everything was over, insisting that even Ghislain had no answer now. He urged everyone to scatter and flee so that at least a few could survive, instead of dying for the ambitions of a reckless noble. His words shook the mercenaries for a moment. Their exhaustion and fear resurfaced instantly. Kyra, irritated by Manus's behavior, casually prepared to kill him on the spot, but Ghislain stopped him. To everyone's surprise, Ghislain calmly gave Manus permission to leave. Then he said something even more shocking. Anyone who wanted to run could do so. When someone asked what he would do, Ghislain simply answered that he would remain and kill the blood python himself. Belinda and Gillian tried to stop him, but he silently drew his sword. For him, success wasn't optional anymore. Manus, believing he had finally been given an escape route, excitedly tried to pull everyone with him. Yet nobody moved. The mercenaries looked between Ghislain and Manus, unable to walk away. Until now, every time danger came, Ghislain had stood in front. He had bled first, fought first, and saved them repeatedly. Leaving him behind no longer felt like survival. It felt like betrayal. Torin stepped forward and asked one question. If they defeated this monster, was the destination truly close? After Ghislain confirmed it, Torin declared he would stay and fight. Gordon followed awkwardly, admitting that if he ran now, he wouldn't even sleep properly afterward. Soon others joined in. They admitted they would be ashamed to call themselves mercenaries if they abandoned the man who had protected them. Manus watched in disbelief as one after another refused him. Looking at them, Ghislain suddenly remembered the warriors from his previous life. Their skills were incomparable, but the look in their eyes was the same. The resolve to face a battle even knowing they might die. Unable to stop himself, Ghislain smiled and quietly told them they had finally become useful. Belinda still hated the decision. She suggested sending the mercenaries forward while Ghislain escaped. But he ignored her and removed his sword's scabbard, throwing it aside. That simple action made everyone understand his intentions. Kyra laughed and admitted he liked that attitude because it reminded him of himself when he was younger. Then the battle began. The blood python screamed and launched forward to swallow them all. Ghislain immediately ordered everyone to scatter. causing the snake to crash headfirst into the ground. Using the opening, Ghislaine attacked its head and finally proved something important. Mana-infused attacks could wound it. The injury was tiny, but it existed. Jillian followed with a devastating axe strike that left a visible crack in the scales, although the monster retaliated by smashing him backward. Kayor attacked from behind and embedded his blade deep into the body before escaping. Ordinary mercenaries swarmed in afterwards, but their weapons bounced uselessly off the scales. Ghislaine adapted instantly. Belinda shifted into support, throwing precise, mana-coated daggers into existing wounds and repeatedly targeting the eyes. Ghislaine realized piercing the scales directly was inefficient. Instead, he changed tactics entirely. The mercenaries were ordered to abandon blades and grab blunt weapons. Their job became striking repeatedly to transfer force through the scales, softening the flesh underneath and widening the wounds created by the stronger fighters. Jillian and Kayor rotated near the head to keep the snake focused, while Belinda created openings. Meanwhile, Ghislaine kept moving constantly, acting as bait and commander at the same time. The mercenaries rushed back in carrying maces, hammers, and clubs. They climbed onto the blood python again and again, ignoring fear and pain, smashing the red scales repeatedly. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't heroic, but little by little, they stopped trying to break the monster and started trying to break what was underneath it. The battle against the blood python turned into pure endurance. Following Ghislaine's orders, the mercenaries abandoned clean sword strikes and instead clung to the monster's enormous body, hammering it repeatedly with blunt weapons. The strategy was simple. If they couldn't pierce the scales, they would crush what lay beneath them. The blood python responded with overwhelming violence. Its tail swept through the battlefield like a natural disaster, sending mercenaries flying and crushing others instantly. Every impact claimed lives, yet the survivors continued replacing the fallen without hesitation. Around the head, Ghislaine, Jillian, and Kayor constantly inflicted shallow wounds and forced the creature's attention onto themselves, while Belinda's daggers cut through openings and pressured its eyes. Bit by bit, their persistence began showing results. The serpent's movement slowed slightly, and eventually cracks appeared across sections of its scales. When Jillian poured mana into his axe and struck one of those weakened areas, the blade buried itself deep into flesh. Blood spilled out for the first time in significant amounts. The mercenaries immediately swarmed the opening, stabbing and smashing at it. For a brief moment, victory seemed possible. But the blood python adapted faster than expected. Though injured, it remained overwhelmingly powerful. Mercenaries were crushed beneath its movements or broken apart by its tail. Ghislaine realized the battle was becoming unwinnable through attrition. The fighters capable of dealing meaningful damage were exhausting their mana rapidly, while the mercenaries continued dying faster than the monster weakened. Then the blood python suddenly retreated. Hope spread through the battlefield. Some wondered if the monster intended to flee. Gordon even muttered whether they could call it a draw. Nobody answered. They all knew the truth. They had reached their limit before the monster reached its own. During the brief pause, Belinda once again suggested retreat. Ghislaine refused. Jillian admitted their strategy worked in theory, but lacked the manpower to sustain it. Together, they agreed the eyes remained their best chance despite the difficulty. When the blood python advanced again, however, it revealed something terrifying. It had learned. Instead of allowing mercenaries to gather around it, the creature began striking individual targets. It withdrew quickly after every attack, crushing people one by one before they could establish pressure. The battlefield descended into confusion. Their only successful tactic had become useless. Ghislaine immediately changed approach again. He pulled the mercenaries back and ordered only himself, Jillian, Kayor, and Belinda to engage directly while everyone else waited for openings. They resumed attacking as before, but now the blood python moved carefully and refused to expose itself. Their wounds became shallow and ineffective. Mana drained, fatigue built. Eventually, Kor reached his limit and volunteered himself as bait. He rushed directly into the blood python's attack range, sacrificing offense just to force its attention. The plan worked. Belinda finally found an opening and poured all remaining mana into a dagger strike aimed directly at its eye. Then despair arrived. The dagger struck and bounced off. The eye itself was harder than the scales. Their final weakness wasn't a weakness at all. Everyone froze. They had exhausted every idea the blood python had been pretending all along. While Belinda reeled from shock, the monster revealed another layer of cunning. Its tail suddenly targeted Kayor, only to bait the others into approaching. At the same instant, its head twisted unnaturally and shot toward Ghislaine with impossible speed. Ghislaine was already committed and couldn't evade. He prepared to detonate every core in his body to survive. Belinda moved first. She shoved Ghislaine away. The blood python's attack smashed into her instead. She flew through the air and crashed into a tree with enough force to kill most people instantly. Yet even then she twisted her body mid-air to reduce the impact. Blood spilled from her mouth as she collapsed. Still conscious, she weakly scolded him, muttering that she had told him to run, and that once he got home, he should lock himself in a room and think about his decisions for once. For a moment, everything stopped. Ghislaine stared. Belinda, the person who had nagged him, protected him, doubted him, and followed him through everything, had nearly died saving him. The blood python seemed satisfied. One of the most troublesome enemies had been removed. But Ghislaine didn't look afraid anymore. He looked angry. Without taking his eyes off the monster, he ordered Cor to take Belinda back. Then he turned toward Jillian and gave a quiet command. Forget the head. Focus on widening the body wound and attack with the mercenaries if an opportunity appears. Jillian immediately understood what Ghislaine meant. And for the first time since entering the Forest of Beasts, she looked genuinely alarmed. Because Ghislaine intended to face the blood python's head alone.